So STEM has always been completely connected to the way that government works. And the most obvious applications of this might be um, the use of mathematics to determine things like taxes or uh, land allocation. And over time, because of the Industrial Revolution, it's only become an even more important aspect to how government policies are formed. So we start with this need to describe financial aspects of government, essentially the economy. We we start with that as our basis for use of STEM, and we move on. We pass through the Industrial Revolution, and we begin to see things like using electronics and cars, engines, right? All of these things add complications to creating laws, um, and without sufficient or without proper regulation of these things, they can become problematic for society, right? For instance, monopolies, things like this, or even now, uh, these monopoly these companies that are forming monopolies are even being tried at the moment. So we're not getting rid of technology and policy; they're inextricably connected, and it's something that we need to improve upon. We need to move forward with the lens of when we create or adopt these new technologies, are we equipped politically, economically, um, etc., to deal with the consequences of these technologies? The most obvious point now would be something like artificial intelligence or quantum computing. Artificial intelligence probably it likely won't remove all jobs or anything like that, right? I think in recent years we've seen um, a lot of news about things like robots and artificial intelligence taking jobs across the world. But really, what we're going to see is that some jobs will be eliminated, and we need to ask ourselves whether that's okay ethically, and whether there's something we can be planning for in the meantime to ensure that the least amount of pain occurs. Quantum computing, on the other hand, it my own bias might show on this. I don't think it's as viable as the promises uh, surrounding it, but there are clear implications for their use um, on how economics is going to work. We already see many um, economic powerhouses, these hedge funds, for instance, they have access to computational techniques that the normal person couldn't have access to. Their modeling and their predicting and their just data access is probably beyond the capabilities of most uh, Americans, let alone most people. Um, and this has already caused a big rift in the economy, right? There's no hiding from the fact that the wealth gap has um, increased in the US. And it seems not unique to the US, right? Um, some of this must be connected. I'm not saying that there's a causation here, but a correlation at the very least. And it's important to recognize that provided the financial requirements to have a quantum computer, even in the most simplest case, these future computational techniques are going to be beyond the capabilities of the ones we have now. And if the situation is already creating a disparity between the lower class, middle class, and the upper class, it's only going to be worse if they have more powerful computations. And there's not an obvious way to go about regulating these, in my opinion, but there has to be something that is done. And this sort of gets at the essence of why I'm doing this. I think there's a problem in science communication, and maybe you've stumbled across some other resources that are good about this, but the majority of science communicators, at least in my field of physics, they're not exactly approaching the populace from a perspective of what actually matters in their day-to-day life. It does happen, right? Of course, like the most common examples might be like Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson. These communicators do have access to people that you and I don't have access to. And much of that is going to be for the intent of creating entertainment rather than educational content. Some of what is both, right? But I think to completely democratize science requires approaching it from a perspective that is more serious. I don't think that this is the only approach, but it's the approach that I'm comfortable with. It is the one that becomes or comes natural to my intentions. I think that there needs to be a balance between entertainment and education. And if I swing one direction, hopefully there are others who will swing, I guess in this case, towards the more fun or entertaining aspects. But it needs to be balanced. And I think creating an educational platform to inform the populace about the impacts that physics can have on their day-to-day lives, I think that's important. As a small tangent, I guess, I've got here written some information about my experience as a physicist and doing my best to communicate in my day-to-day life what I do, why I do it, and what does it matter. Okay. First off, personally, it is difficult to contain all of these things. My own bias would suggest that it's important because I enjoy it. But you might not. The general population probably doesn't care. So what is the impact and why am I doing it then, right? So pretty much the way that one of these conversations go is that I might tell somebody that I'm a physicist, and it's always approached, especially if this is somebody who doesn't know me very well, or isn't like an acquaintance of a friend, or 1 or 2 degrees removed. This is more so like random strangers. Oftentimes you'll say something like, "Oh yeah, I study physics. I'm a PhD in physics, or I'm a graduate student in physics," something like this, and their reaction is unfortunately this like prideful, "Ha, I wasn't good at math," or, "Oh, I took physics and it was too hard for me," things like this. And I really think that that's, speaks not necessarily about those people, but the environments that they're brought up in, that the idea of having this sort of like ironic, or like this sort of pride in their negligence of the subject, or ignorance of the subject, at no fault of their own necessarily, but like they feel like it is this accepted thing to say something like, "Oh, I'm not good at math," or something like this. It's a skill that you need to train, just like any other skill. You might have some people who are naturally talented, but it doesn't matter, right? Because you can always improve. But that's where it usually starts, is, well, I'm not very good at math, or I'm not good at physics, I didn't enjoy math, I didn't enjoy physics, or something like that. Internally I'm cringing a little bit, because I'm like, I'm sorry, like, I don't know where to go with that usually. And so my approach would be to find the baseline. Where can I meet this person, hopefully at their level? And it oftentimes requires me to take a step back all the way to something like maybe a high school or middle school science class, like a chemistry class or something, and kind of reminding them that all around us are atoms. They have their nucleus and their electrons that are surrounding them. And in my field, we're specifically studying solids. I would consider myself a solid state physicist. There's other names for this, but I'm interested specifically in transport in solid state, which I'll get into in a moment. But when I bring up solid state, I don't think that people oftentimes understand what I mean by solids in this case, because I don't necessarily mean like my desk or something like that. I'm talking specifically about solids that are probably semiconductors, right? Things like that. And so I have to explain, like, where do you connect with solid state in your day-to-day lives? It's going to be pretty much all of the digital technology that you use, right? Your cell phone, which, I don't want to say everyone, because that's a lie. But many people have a cell phone, right? If you're watching this video, you're probably doing it on a device that you own. And that device works on the principles that are studied in solid state physics. Essentially, the small components in the phone are this like crystallized form of silicon atoms, which is essentially like a refined sand, right? You refine this sand, create it into a pristine crystal, and you can start carving out circuits with it, basically electric circuits. And it turns out that this silicon is a very good substance to process digital logic or binary, right? Either zeros or ones. And this is where the quantum transport of, or the transport side of my research comes in, is in these digital electronics, we're currently using the flow or absence of flow of electrons through this crystal as a means to create the logic that our computers use. And so your phone has a billion or billions of these transistors, as they're called, which are electrical components that process these zero or ones, or actually, quite frankly, create the zero or ones. They are the single bits of information. And by creating this collection of billions of them, you can start creating powerful devices like your phone or your laptop, right? And that is so far removed from everybody's day-to-day lives that it's kind of underappreciated. I think that it's difficult to stress how impacted our day-to-day lives are by the sort of technological revolution that happened in solid-state physics, right? As a tangent inside a tangent, solid-state physics came about in the 50s, right? 1950s. We've had about 70, 80 years of solid-state physics being a thing. And we've already seen the impact becoming beyond what was probably thought possible in, the 1930s or 40s, when the field was likely just getting started, right? So we go from the 1950s, creating the first solid-state television and solid-state radio, to the late 80s with the Game Boy, right? And the Super Nintendo, things like that. These were impressive feats of engineering that we look at them now and they seem so old, right? They're dated, they're retro. We even use the word retro, right? They're so old now. We've come so far in the age of human civilization. That's brand new. But in the rapid increase in technology that we've seen over the last 50 years or so, it feels so long ago, right? It's older than me, right? And so I really can't stress enough how important this field is to day-to-day life, but it's not appreciated the same way from the general population because it's not as interesting, right? It's not the most exciting field of physics, right? If you want that, go listen to Michio Kaku talk or something like that, right? Brian Greene. Let somebody blow your mind with these facts about general relativity or quantum field theory or string theory or something. Those things are beautiful. There's a reason why those people make a lot of money going out and talking about these things. But to democratize science is not to only focus on the things that are beautiful. It's quite frankly about making sure that you have a breadth of knowledge so that you can make informed decisions about the use of technology in day-to-day life. Like the fact that solid-state physics exists is why misinformation and disinformation are so readily spread across the internet, right? Without solid-state physics, we wouldn't have Twitter or Facebook. We wouldn't have these technologies that speed up communication to a point where it's disastrous, right? We wouldn't have, these concerns about privacy because of the um, the selling of your personal data online. All of these things are inextricably connected to both solid state physics and government policy. And we can bridge a gap here. It's maybe not going to be the most fun gap for me to fill, but I see it and I want to put out there what I can to make it a more cohesive I want to make a more cohesive approach to science communication that allows the democratization of the science. I want it to be put in the hands of the users and the power to be with those users. So to finish up my little tangent about my own experiences communicating day to day with people who are outside of the field of physics, I really like this story because it was so unique for me as a physicist to be in this situation. I was spending some time with some friends, and this one friend's father and older brother had asked me, like, oh, you're a physicist, like what do you study? And I go straight to explaining that I study solid state physics, and I go through the baseline search, and amazingly these people were relatively knowledgeable. They weren't maybe even near hobbyist level knowledgeable, but they had questions that I had never heard from somebody. And so when I started to say that I study solid state and transport of electrons through the solids, I mentioned that like a transistor, right? A transistor is the processing or is the bit of information, right? And by combining these, you can create the computer circuits that you have today. And this person asks me like, oh, that's so cool. Like, do you think that if I could show you like an AMD CPU schematic, would you be able to interpret what is there and tell me how it works? And like, that's cool. I'm a computer enthusiast. I love these technologies. That's part of the reason why I did physics. But unfortunately, that's not what I study. I don't know it at the level that would be adequate to be able to have a conversation surrounding CPU architecture. I might be able to point out like, oh, here's where the processors cores are. Here's where the the cache is or something, right? But even for me, that's an abstract concept to some extent. I computer program, but I don't do it in like low level languages like assembly or anything like that. So I don't know exactly how to connect all of those parts to like application or something. I just know that, data when it's processed gets stored in cache, right? Like things like that. And, depending on your application, bigger cache, better, right? Things like that. So I don't think that went well, right? Because what happens next is they ask kind of like, why don't you now and then, right? Like, you're saying that you work on things like this, but you don't work on like creating a CPU architecture or something. And I'm left thinking to myself, like, how do I communicate that this is something that is more fundamental to physics than engineering, right? Without losing their interest, because they're clearly interested. They're actually like, uh, you know, kind of captivated in the conversation, and I need to find a way to keep that captivation because that feels good for me to be able to make sure I can have a conversation about it rather than an exposition, right? Uh, so basically, I let them know, like, I essentially work on studying a single transistor in a hypothetical future technology, and it's so far removed from engineering that it's not clear how an engineering application would be used, like to create something like 11 billion transistors for an iPhone or whatever it is, right? I'm working on what is effectively a hypothetical transistor, single transistor, and not even trying to look at the processing of information in it. I'm literally looking at the flow of the electrons through that material, right? How do I manipulate the flow of electrons, and how does that influence the possibility for creating a new type of transistor, something like that, right? It's so far removed from engineering. I don't even know that there are actual like transistors or transistor circuits made from this, right? I'm sure somebody has done it, but the idea here is that it's so fundamental. I'm trying to understand how and why more so than how I'm going to use it, right? And so I kind of lost steam in the conversation. I struggled to maintain interest myself and to maintain their interest and also make my point, right? Physics is about studying fundamentals, right? Science seeks to gain knowledge about the basics first so that engineers and technicians can use these later on. Um, Science is kind of not necessarily something that the everyday person uh, gets to interface with. I have a lot of friends in astronomy, and one of the big things is that they study here at my apartment is, like, how are what is the structure of a galaxy, something like that. Like how are these galaxies producing high energy X-rays or something along these lines, and like what service does that provide to right now or even future technology? I don't think that's a fair question to ask, for the same reason that my field of study is kind of removed from immediate application. There's value in it that we may not realize yet, right? Quantum mechanics, when it was founded, was not intended to be this big revolution for technology in the future, right? I think it eventually came to be that people believed that, but it wasn't necessarily expected at the advent, right? They didn't even know that molecules or atoms existed until I think the 20s, right? Like the 1920s, that is. It's difficult to overstate how the things that physicists study may not immediately have an impact. But that doesn't mean that they won't, right? So, my point is to say, I think for my own ego, it's nice to be told that I'm highly intelligent or something because I study physics. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that there's a lot more of it is likely attributed to interest and motivation. But the reality of being a physicist is lonely. It's difficult even amongst my peers to have a conversation about these things at the fundamental level. Much of it is going to end up being, maybe a 10-minute talk where I get to, or like a presentation that is like a academic talk, like a presentation on my research where it lasts maybe 10 minutes and I scraped the surface very superficially. Or I might talk to my more immediate colleagues who have a similar research area, and that's great. But it doesn't go anywhere, right? There's no lasting impact of these conversations typically. Like, I'm currently, cross my fingers, going to be published soon, and maybe that will have a different feeling of like the social side of gratification. Probably not. Quite frankly, I don't. I'm not exactly working in one of the big hype fields, right? So the likelihood of citations will probably be my own and maybe a couple colleagues. It's not something that I get to communicate very often, and so it's lonely, right? And the big issue is that I think I'm approaching it wrong, right? I think my communication to the public doesn't need to be purely from the standpoint of the fundamentals. I think my skills as a scientist and as an educator extend beyond the fundamentals of physics, that is. And my hope is to be able to address STEM more widely, and physics. I fully will be leaning into the physics more often than not, I think. But I want to focus on a breadth of information that is useful towards the democratization of science, right? Of physics and technology. I want it to be more widespread. I want to be able to do outreach in a way that feels good for me, but also hopefully for somebody else, right? And with that being said, I don't get to talk about cool science. Maybe you'll have a different opinion, but I'm not going to show you these beautiful like Hubble photos or something to entice you. I don't have necessarily the most beautiful field of study, but I do want to hopefully cause there to be intrigue surrounding how quantum mechanics and solid state physics impact day-to-day life, whether that be maybe hopefully a more organized video essay on, the advent of the solid state transistor or something, right? The history of nanofabrication or something like this, right? There's a lot that can be done that hopefully is in some sense interesting, but maybe inspirational in some other regards for somebody who maybe is interested in physics or solid state or quantum mechanics, but is kind of skeptical based on the popular, more colloquial problems, right? Schrodinger's cat is not really something I consider in my research, right? But what do I do, right? How do I use physics to describe reality? And the sad part is you quite frankly lose a lot of the philosophy surrounding it. The non-objectivity of quantum mechanics seems like it would be a big part of my day-to-day life as a physicist, but it turns out it's not, right? It's sort of, famous quote from Feynman, right? Like, shut up and calculate. You can kind of brush these things under the rug. And those questions are valid. Those questions are interesting. Their consequences are very important for certain technologies, but in day-to-day life, Schrodinger's cat doesn't really affect you, right? You're not gonna pass through the floor because of like quantum tunneling or something, as like people have these thoughts about, right? I really do think though that it's been a shortcoming on my part as both a physicist and an educator to, up until now, not have a good way to communicate to others about physics. And, I'm not going to go out and start like canvassing, right? I'm not going to go door to door and be like, have you heard about our Lord and Savior, Sir Isaac Newton or something, right? I do my best in the classroom when I have the ear of the students to, I was going to say, try and get them to enjoy it, but I think I'm a little too serious sometimes as an instructor. Maybe some of the content that I post will have a similar vibe, but that's okay. Mostly doing this for me. But I'm going to try and turn around my communication skills and how to go about approaching the general populace for communicating about science. I really do think that there's something to be done here. I'm not sure exactly the plan I'm going to follow, but we'll see. And I guess the thing to leave off with is my hope is to find a way to communicate about science that is effectively geared towards the general populace, the stakeholders of technology, the people who are going to invest their time and finances into it, and hopefully provide them with knowledge that they might not have gotten elsewhere, or even just posing questions or exposing them to the ethical questions of, how does physics work? How does technology work? And I don't mean that in the sense of like, what are the laws of physics, or how does, the AMD CPU work. More so, what impact does it have on day-to-day life? How does physics impact the speed of communication today? How does technology affect the way that we engage with each other? How does it impact politics and elections? I think there's a lot to be talked about, and I'll try and gear it to hopefully a decent amount of popular topics, ones that are interesting but can still be related back to my main goal of democratizing science. And then, I think I'm going to create content that is a little more self-gratifying. I am a educator at heart, and I'm trapped in the role of a grad student until I graduate and, maybe find something else to do with my life. But I haven't gotten to do much education in the way of things that are more interesting to me, right? Like, as much as I love teaching introductory physics, it's not very captivating. It's not mathematically as interesting. Like, there are aspects of it, don't get me wrong, that are interesting, but like quantum mechanics and even classical mechanics at a more sophisticated level than introductory physics, all of these things are a lot more interesting to me as an educator and as a physicist. And so I think there has to be content surrounding that, and we'll see how that goes. And so my plan, this is kind of my schematic for the content, is one, to create maybe some video essays on topics that such as like the Chips and Science Act, right? The National Quantum Initiative, things like this that are kind of very pertinent today, but may not be fully registered by the populace. Artificial intelligence, we've been seeing so much information about this lately that it's kind of scary, right? But do we really have to be scared of ChatGPT? I don't know. Let's find out, right? So number one will be hopefully some video essays. Those will probably be less frequent just because of the amount of time it takes to create them. I want to do what I might call whiteboard videos. These are going to be focused on more hard approaches to science. Like, this is probably going to be more content geared towards people who have a mathematical background or a physics background rather than the general populace. I may do some whiteboard videos that are a little more geared towards the general populace. Like, I think it'd be really great to do one on how quantum computing works, the fundamental concepts of how quantum computer works. I've done a course, helped create a course on that and presented at the American Physical Society back a year or two ago on that course, right? That is something that I think could be used as a path forward for democratizing physics. How useful it'll be, I don't know. We'll see. So finally, so there's video essays, whiteboard videos. If I have the energy and aptitude and motivation for it, I think it'd be really interesting to be able to sit down, kind of podcast style, hopefully not too stiff or rigorous, but just chat with some of the resources that I have, right? I'm currently in a state school physics department, right? I have access to people who are very knowledgeable in physics and have more experience day to day than I have as being a physicist or being a science communicator and so on and so forth. I think creating a podcast of some sort surrounding that could be interesting, and we'll see if it happens. I think if there's one bit of content that would be the first time the chopping block, it'd probably be that one, just because of the amount of work, and like finding people who are worth talking to, setting up the camera rig and getting mics and stuff. Like, we'll see. Great, we'll see. But my hope is to create a variety of educational content, whether it be video essays, or hopefully more organized than this right here. This is more so just an introductory video, whiteboard videos to get into the details and really soak in the math, right? Like, that's the fun part for me in a sense. And then finally, spreading the democratization here. I want my peers to lead by example. I think if I can get my peers to also take it seriously that we need to form a way to communicate with the public, maybe that's a good place to start, somewhere around campus. I don't know about local government or anything, but maybe around campus, or virtually meeting with people at other campuses, maybe at a conference or something. If there's the availability, maybe I can sit down during those times with some people to do a short interview or something. I think there's something here, and we'll see.